Good afternoon, everybody. Let's see, first things first, everybody in the last two series of tables has to come up. Steve, you got to move up. Jody, you got to move up. Sorry, you just won't be able to hear how wonderful this presentation is. My name is John Janson, just helping out with this particular topic. We have two speakers. One in the back trying to get our thumb drive loaded. And do we have a thumbs up? We have a thumbs up. Yes, we do. Cool. And you have the advancing thing too. Yep, hello. We're all set. Good.
Hello.
So this item, I think, is something that we're all dealing with. This question of what sort of infill should we try and do in our community, if our community will allow us to do any, which is always also an interesting question. But Nick Norris, the planning director for Salt Lake City, is here, and I hope you all have read something about Salt Lake City, that they have initiated quite a few changes to their zoning ordinance with an enthusiastic city council. How about that? Yeah. So he's going to talk about the new options in their ordinance that they've accomplished over the last year? About a year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
Okay. A little bit longer, maybe. And Delaney Sillma is with Logan Simpson Design. She's a consultant, a planner, and is working in several communities on infill options. One of those is Ogden. Is anybody from Ogden here today? Oh, look at that. There we go. That already has options, but we're going to add to them, likely. So what are those options? They're going to talk about that, and that's your cue.
Thank you, John. So, as John mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit at first about kind of general infill options, and then Nick will get into a little bit more detail about Salt Lake and what's going on there. So, generally, to get started, we all in Utah have probably seen kind of this image before. There are lots of places throughout the state and in the Intermountain West where we have really unique traditional development that has then been divided and divided and divided, and then we're left with really funny shaped lots. And in these photos here, you can see that we've got some extremely long lots. And then we've got some that just have a nice big gaping space in the middle of our block that just is calling out for something to go there. And the questions that we have in the communities that we work with, Ogden in particular currently, is how we can address filling in those spaces. So some existing conditions in some of the communities that we're working in now, particularly in Ogden, is that there is a lack of developable land, at least greenfields, right? So those interior lots and some redevelopment is where we are seeing a lot of new housing options. The lot sizes and the shapes reflect that kind of odd, old, traditional settlement, which is our 10 acres that were divided into our 1 acres of farmable land, and then since then the world has changed, and so have they. And then we also, in the city of Ogden particularly, but in several communities, have a lot of much older residential neighborhoods. Those are our pre-1950s neighborhoods that we'll talk a little bit more about in kind of specific, because there's some interesting things that you can do in some of those older communities. So in Ogden, we have this concept of flexible subdivisions, which is going to kind of guide the conversation that we have here. Obviously, these are just kind of a set of options, and I'm going to keep it pretty high level as we go through several of the options, which are not all-encompassing. So the idea of these flexible subdivisions is generally that they are in keeping with the underlying zoning. We're not adding a ton of additional density, but we're allowing for flexibility with the lot dimensions and several other kind of little bits of flexibility that we'll talk about in each of the options. And then also, like I mentioned, it's all about filling in those extra spaces that don't necessarily have our perfect grid. They don't necessarily fit some of the underlying zoning that has emerged since they were initially subdivided and a little bit goofy shaped. So to get started, one of the first options is something that Ogden has already been doing for a while. So a concept, the residential infill subdivision, is something that is in Ogden's existing code. And you can see here, these are a couple of examples. The interior of the block has an access road. This is slightly smaller than normally allowed. Of course, there are safety considerations. Nick will get a little bit more into that as well. But the give and take here is that these lots are, addressing the underlying zone. They're not horrifyingly small. And that access strip is slightly flexible to allow for the maximum amount of space in these interior lots. Something else to increase the flexibility here is a zero lot line provision. So within the subdivision, the lot or the building can actually abut the lot line, with the exception, of course, of the kind of periphery lots. And this, again, just allows you to maximize those kind of strange shapes. Building on this concept and, again, trying to fill in those really long lots or those in-between spaces is this concept of flag lots. I think we very briefly touched on that in the last presentation in this room as well. Here you can see, again, we have this access strip, which is helping to make use of the space behind the initial lot. And some considerations here and things that we have, had conversations about in Ogden. For this access strip, there are restrictions to protect the neighborhood. Obviously, you need access to that rear lot, the flag lot. And that means that the access strip can only be a certain length. Here we also want to consider how folks react to the addition of this building on the flag lot. And in order to be kind of considerate of what's going on around it, the height of that building is something that you can really focus on as well. Whether that is that the periphery, the flag lot building is shorter or equal to the height of the front lot, or that there's some sort of averaging that you consider. To build on the flag lot even further, this lots on a private right-of-way is just kind of adding to that. So in our development of this in the city of Ogden, the private right-of-way is a maximum of 400 feet. And then, of course, because of that additional length, the access needs to be, it needs a turnaround. And there are special provisions for ensuring safety and fire access. So something, and this is something that the city, again, is already doing. So this cottage lot concept is very similar to, again, if you all were in the last session, and you may have heard the concept of an ADU on a separate lot. They are very similar in certain ways. So you can see here that the initial lot is now divided. We have this much smaller cottage lot that is a minimum of 1,500 square feet. And the lot already has access, so you don't have to consider the access strip, the flagpole, or the private right-of-way. And here it really allows for additional infill options. And then, to go back to that concept of the ADU on a separate lot, these have special kind of ownership considerations that could go with them as well. The city of Farmington, as we discussed in the previous session, if you all were in this room, has already been working really hard on this too. So there is a precedent for this in the Wasatch Front. And you can see There are ways to make them very attractive. Oftentimes, there is an easement for access, unless, of course, they are accessible, which would make them kind of like that cottage lot that we saw on the previous slide. So those are several of the options that we are playing with in different communities. And something that we have heard and kind of worked with the community on is how do we make these infill options fit? So there are different ways of doing that. And here you can see on the slide, this is an example of the front setback averaging. So for your block, as you're trying to fill in those holes, you want to make sure that whatever it is that is going in there is responsive to the community that's already there. So you can do that by averaging height or the front setback. In this case, averaging the setback within 3 buildings from the infill building. And you can also utilize some special provisions for established neighborhoods, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And then you can also use something very interesting that Ogden is doing on some of their projects is coupling some of these infill developments with renovation projects, which is very cool. And I think Nick will also talk about that a little bit too. Just the fact that you're adding much more benefit in rehabilitating existing buildings and also providing that continuity in the neighborhood itself. So I mentioned established neighborhoods a couple of times, and this is a special kind of backdoor way of addressing building design. So obviously we know that in single family, we cannot really have a heavy hand in the way that building design is regulated. And there are some exceptions. So in residential neighborhoods that are primarily developed before 1950, we can add a few additional building design regulations. So this is something that is also up to the community. Here you can see in Ogden, there are a lot of pre-1950s residential homes. There is not specific guidance around what constitutes a neighborhood. It could be something as small as a few blocks. It could be something as big as a neighborhood plan. And so there's some leeway there as well. So in these places, we can have some additional say over building materials, fenestration, architectural details that need to be added, and that sort of thing. So we have asked in Ogden specifically a couple of questions about the types of things that folks would like to see. We were slightly surprised by some of the responses that we got. Generally, a lot of folks, and of course we haven't talked to every single person, so everybody may have some alternative ideas here, but generally folks were not as concerned about the architectural details as they were about building mass and building materials. A caveat to the building materials is that folks were also less concerned about matching building materials necessarily as they were about having materials that they themselves found attractive and seemed like high quality materials. So of course that is a little bit hard to put in your code, but helpful to understand that of course beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We've heard that a lot from folks too, but that it's a little bit more nuanced than just everything needs to be brick. So that was a really interesting finding. Again, in making it fit, these are just some good examples of how massing was really important to folks. Other things that we heard a lot about were landscaping. Some folks were interested in things like roof lines, etc. And we heard a lot about garages. So that was another thing. Some of those really beautiful bungalows that you see have garages in the rear of the building, and people were really interested in seeing that continuity in new development as well. And that has been happening in a lot of infill development in the city. These were some of the highest choices, just to illustrate the vast diversity in the types of building materials and designs that folks found acceptable to kind of fit into these spaces, whether established neighborhoods or not. So we see tons of diversity in the building materials, roof lines, massing, et cetera. But these were things that community members found compelling and wanted to see. So I won't go too deeply into incentivizing these infill options, but these are some of the things that came up and that are already in practice, whether in Ogden or other places. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Nick.
All right, thanks everybody, and congratulations to making it past 3 o'clock on a Friday at a conference. I need to stand and so I can see what I'm talking about, but I'm Nick Norris. I'm the planning director for Salt Lake City, and instead of talking about what we have done, I wanted to use an ongoing project to talk about how we're doing it and how we're having the conversations and how we're analyzing regulations to determine how to be some more supportive for infill development, particularly in residential zones. So we're going to talk about how you start. You know, what problem are you trying to solve with affordable or with infill development? And in Salt Lake City, you've heard of this at almost every session I think you've been at yesterday or today. And Salt Lake City's not unique, but we all know housing's going up faster than incomes. All of our cities' land, well, I won't say all, most cities' land is a finite thing, right? You only have so much of it. In Salt Lake City, and I know other cities and communities along the Wasatch Front and in other cities in the country, we're seeing our elementary schools close, right? Fewer and fewer households are having school-age children in them. And then our zoning really is limiting small-scale housing types. So these are all problems that we try to solve with, there's other problems as well, but these are the kinds of issues we're trying to look at with infill housing. We start by looking at how our city developed and how and why we have the housing that we do. So these are all different housing types in various neighborhoods in Salt Lake City, ranging from the top left, small lot, detached, single-family home. That thing's like 12 feet wide, I think, to historic townhomes, to walk-up apartments, to duplexes, including duplexes that are up and down. These are all buildings that people love, right? Like, who doesn't like any of these buildings? Right? I think we all love them. The problem is we don't allow any of them anymore. And so when we look at zoning, what regulations were in place at the time that those types of buildings were built? This is Salt Lake City's very first citywide zoning map. You can see all of those, 6 zoning districts at the bottom. We had a residential A zone. These are the uses that are allowed. Those are highlighted shows up as orange on this screen. But as you can see, most of the city allowed something else. These are our historic neighborhoods. Even these zones allowed other types of housing. I thought one of the more interesting things is that we allowed student dorms in places that weren't even close to universities, but they were on our streetcar lines, and that's how we got people around. 1948 was the first time that we had exclusive single-family zone in the city. If you're familiar with Salt Lake City, that little area highlighted in yellow, that's the Federal Heights neighborhood right next to the University of Utah. One of our oldest and more historic neighborhoods, also probably top 2 or 3 wealthiest neighborhoods in our city. By 1958, that had spread to include the upper avenues. So this is about east of 13th Ave. One of the interesting things to note is that this had just barely been platted. So there were no homes built yet. So this was the first real area in the city where past city leaders decided we want single-family residential. It's also important to note the era that this happened. So mid-50s, it had been about 50 years since the Supreme Court outlawed racial-based zoning, and other parts of the city or of the state, starting on the West Coast and the Southeast, started writing zoning codes that were meant to replace those racial-based zones. Salt Lake City was definitely, as I'm sure many other cities that you're familiar with, was definitely a red line city. We had the red line maps, and these were areas that were initially redlined. So one thing that maybe people don't know that's really unique about Salt Lake is that we hardly had any single-family only zoning through the mid-90s. So a lot of that was probably because our historic neighborhoods had a whole mix of housing. These areas in yellow, you can see where it had expanded to be single-family only zoning. So the area around the avenue is Capitol Hill. On the right hand of the screen is the Upper East Bench, so east of Foothill Drive, and then some pockets of mostly undeveloped land along the Jordan River. This is what happened in 1995. This is when we adopted broad single-family only zoning. These are the zones we have, covered a significant part of the city, new areas that historically had not been developed that way. And so this gave us some insight into how we got to where we were. And for the most of the history of the city, when it comes to zoning, we allowed a mix of housing types. In 1995, we adopted a comprehensive rewrite of our code, and most of that went away. And so as we look at our current regulations, particularly these three zones, the first thing we looked at, well, how does lot size impact housing? And so in these zones, you can see the numbers up here, but the big takeaway here is that 35% of all the lots that are zoned on one of the R1s don't even meet the minimum lot size that we established in 1995. So you have to question, where did those numbers come from? The only one that makes real logical sense is the R1 5000 that we'll get into in a little bit. But to read those numbers, so R1, we all know what that means, and then the big number is the minimum lot area associated with that. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, which is key, is that up until 1995, legally existing lots, so if it went through a subdivision process, were exempt from the minimum lot sizes that were in our code. That was only meant for new lots. It wasn't meant for anything that existed prior to the 1950s. And then when we go through this, we create a list. So with this project, we're looking at what can we do? Can we consolidate our R1 zones? Can we allow more housing types in those zones? And what are the barriers to doing that? And so we create these little charts that talk about, that kind of show the impact and the cost. So this is kind of a cost-benefit analysis for the city, and which ones are going to get the biggest bang for the buck. We know all of these things are going to be controversial. So if that's equal, what is our next determining factor on moving forward? Lot widths. So I'm going to get a little bit geeky and nerdy here, but everyone knows, if you're a planner in Utah, you've heard of the Plat of Zion. And you know that Salt Lake City and hundreds of other cities in the Intermountain West have been based off of that. What a lot of people don't know is how we got the measurements that we got. So the Plat of Zion used a term perch, which is equal to a rod, which in the 1800s was a very common way to measure things. One rod is 16 and a half feet. And you can see, unless you're in the back and can't read that, but you can kind of see where suddenly we get these 10-acre blocks and where they came from and how they were intended to be divided. Sometime around the 1930s, the use of rods and chains went away, and they were replaced just with common things, 25 feet. So the point being is that in 1995, for these zones, we created minimum lot widths that, one, didn't match our built environment at all. Because we've never had a consistent minimum lot width in the city. So we have some lots that are 16 and a half. We have some that are 33. We have some that are, 48 and a half. We have some that are 66. We have some that are 50. We have some that are 75. We even have some that are 25. So we established, for whatever reason, in 1995, some sort of a standard, but in doing so, we made a high number of our lots complying. At the same time, flag lots, you've heard a lot about that if you're in the previous session or in here. In 1995, we added a crazy provision that said if you wanted to do a flag lot, the flag lot itself had to be no smaller than 1.5 times the minimum lot size of that zone. So you can see what that means. If R1 12,000, you need 30,000 square feet to even get a second home on that property. And then obviously use restrictions. So this is a map that shows where in the city in yellow where only single family detached is allowed. And then you can see the blue is 2-family, which is pretty minimal, and the red. One of the things, if you're familiar with Salt Lake City, is those areas that are in blue and red are also the areas where all of our commercial uses are. And where smaller scale residential is competing with very large scale residential. And the small scale residential that helps us solve our problems, builds more housing for families, creates more home ownership opportunities, et cetera, are all competing with something where they're not going to be the financial winner in that. No one's going to build a 4-unit townhome if they can also build a 25-unit apartment building on that property. And so we started modeling, taking all these things into consideration. What could we look at to increase more infill development? So one is allow other housing types. So, these are self-explanatory. But one of the things that we've quickly realized, and I hope other communities have too, is that each one of these building types has to have its specific regulations. You can't try to fit and develop a regulation that works for a detached single-family home and a 4-plex or a 5-plex or a 6-plex. It's just not going to work. And so we looked at all of our 3 zones, and what happens if we lowered the lot size, if we reduced setbacks, and eliminated building coverage. How many people have a maximum percentage of the lot that can be covered by all buildings? Quite a few. I would say get rid of it if you can. Because what this table demonstrates, if you look at the max lot coverage on the second row from the bottom, after you apply the setbacks and have a buildable area, you're leaving sometimes thousands of square feet of lot that ends up just being usually grass and sod, right? It's landscaped area almost always, or it's big, huge driveways that are often, at least in Salt Lake City, underutilized, that increases our storm runoff and impacts our storm drains and everything else. And so the idea here is that if you lowered the minimum lot size, you can start to see that you can make some homes work that are smaller. So we have a zone, this is one of our R1 zones, R1 5000, compared to one of our infill zones that was created probably about 15 years ago now, called SR3. That's a special development pattern made for the interiors of our old historic neighborhoods. And you can see don't worry about the numbers. The takeaway here is that if all you did was reduce the minimum lot size, you're not necessarily going and kept setbacks the same, lot coverages, et cetera, the same. You're not going to have a financially viable, buildable area to build something on. And so for us, the takeaway is not only do we need to change the minimum lot size, we need to be flexible with setbacks. We need to be flexible with lot coverages. We looked at another zone. So this is in a real project that you can see, a real development. Anyone want to guess how many homes are in that picture? If you're in Salt Lake, you can't. You're 4? Yeah, I mean, it says on there, right? But it's 4 homes. And you can kind of see the single-family home. Actually, that's a duplex, I think, next to it. But you can see the historic scale and how it fits in. This is another one of our zones that we adopted in, I think, 2016. That is producing infill development, and we wanted to compare it to see what would happen with the R1 5000 zone and to see what happens. And the takeaway here, obviously, is this is a way to get more homes and other housing types in your neighborhood and fit the scale. This definitely fits the scale. This zone has a reduced parking requirement, which helps, and it was alley accessed. This is in the same zone. So on the left-hand side is the before. It's a single-family home on what was a double lot. So this was a, I think these were 49-foot lots, so this is 96 feet. So these were lots that were based on the rod, not the base 25. But in this zone, it also allows other housing types. And so here because of the flexibility in the zone, they were able to keep the historic home on the right. They built a new single-family home next to it with a walkway that leads to 3 townhomes behind it. These are all for sale product, and parking is alley accessed. This street also has quite a bit of on-street parking as well. And so I think our takeaway is that modern versions of historic building types can be viable. These are all new build products in Salt Lake City that have utilized some of our past infill options. So on the left, detached single-family homes on a typical, this is essentially a flag lot development in a different zone than our R1 zones, but they're single-family homes. Each one of those lots is, between 25 and 3,000 square feet. We have 3 detached homes on what was an 8,000 square foot lot with a publicly accessible walkway that leads to a track station. And then we have townhomes that are, each of those townhomes are 18 feet wide, and they're all in zones that either don't have the big barrier regulations, the minimum lot area, the minimum lot widths, lot coverages, and things like that. And so there's some flexibility. Sometimes they do have to go through a process. So this development on the left did have to go through a plan development because in Salt Lake City, lots on private streets have to go through a plan development process. So what we look at and what we've kind of centered on here is what regulations do you need to have successful infill development? So obviously the use and building type, you have to allow those in the zone. Reducing the setbacks and the lot size. At some point, if you're a built-out city, you really have to ask yourself, is a minimum lot width serving any purpose at all? And the reality is it probably isn't, especially when most of your lots, at least in Salt Lake, have been created through a subdivision already. So changing those requires a subdivision amendment to create new lots. And so there's already a process to go through. And then you also have the fire codes, which are going to kick in, and everything else. And so we talk a lot about eliminating regulations that are no longer purposeful or never were purposeful for that matter. And one of the big things that helps is limiting the maximum size of the home. So even if you have a 3,500 square foot lot and someone could put a home with a 2,000 square foot footprint, without a regulation, you're going to get a 4,000 square foot home. That's never going to be affordable, and it defeats a lot of the purposes and goals. Now it does provide others, right? You're creating some more family-sized housing, but it's only going to be affordable to those who can afford that large of a home. We've been fascinated with Durham, North Carolina. So this is a summary of what they did with a small lot infill development. I highly encourage you to look up their expanding housing choices. Because they've proven that this works. So they adopted this in 2019. You can read the details here. The bottom 2 bullets are really the key things. So what this does is that it's an option that allows someone to do small lot development within the existing single-family zoning district. And so it essentially waives the minimum lot sizes and things like that. They still have some regulations, as you can see. So they've had 215 small lot homes built since 2019. Most of those were built in areas with lower wealth areas. They did not have an increase in demolitions in those areas compared to the more wealthy areas as well. So that's a sign that they really weren't seeing displacement, that it was homeowners who were choosing to do this with their property. And then you can see the difference in the median sales price. And I think for those of us who are in very expensive cities to live in, I think we would take that all day long if we could get to that point. So the key takeaways, you have to be comprehensive with the changes you make. You can't just look at one thing, or else you're making changes to make changes. It's not going to achieve the solutions that you're looking for. It's always going to be controversial. So you might as well do if you're going to get skewered in rooms and be called some unimaginable names because you're proposing this, you might as well make it worth it. Tell a relatable story. So for us, we focused on how our city and our residents love our historic neighborhoods. So we want to go back to that historic way of doing things. And I think it's been more relatable for people to hear that than it is, at least for us, to talk about the racial injustices and things like that zoning has created. And yes, small scale is possible. These are 4 more all new build projects that range from, again, another really small home up to small scale apartments. So that's all I have.
There we go, I think. Is that working? So, chance for questions. And do I get to ask one right off the bat? Sorry. Any design regulations on all that infill in Salt Lake? I mean, like...
Yeah, we have some. So the examples that I was showing are all in zoning districts that have some street engagement requirement. Our focus is really on that. So entrances, porches, things like that. We're in our residential zones, we're not as concerned about like the building materials that was more important in Ogden. I think we have a lot of people in our city that would like that, but if you looked at those small scale homes, most of those were actually stucco homes. And so, including one that had to go through a historic landmarks commission approval. So, yeah.
Okay, there's a question right here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. For Ogden, I was curious, how many lots do you allow for your flag lots? How many houses can be built in a flag lot zone?
So the options that we had outlined were just 2. So either you can have the stacked, so long as the access isn't over 150 feet, and then the kind of double behind.
And then how do you maintain the access? Like, who do you put in charge of that?
So that's part of the flag lot, so the owner of the flag lot.
But if there's 2, do they both share that responsibility?
Yeah.
And are they informed of that up front before they call the city?
Yeah, and that's something that you can manage as well. I think there's probably several different ways that you could manage that. But yeah.
And then on the smaller lots in Salt Lake, the 2,500 to 3,100, you showed a slide in that those houses didn't even look like there was a driveway between them. How many feet between the houses does there have to be?
So we don't have we rely on fire code for that. We don't have, so we do have side yard setbacks, and that's gonna vary based on the zone. Some of them are 0, some of them are as small as 4 feet. But because those projects go through a plan development process, we have the ability to modify those, and we focus more on the perimeter setbacks in projects like that than we do in the interior types of setbacks.
So Nick, how much are you worrying about parking?
My honest opinion is I don't worry about it. I mean, to be frank, if we want a city for cars, we're gonna plan for cars, right? And the reality is we're gonna change. We're changing already. Around our transit stations and in our downtown, we have no minimum parking requirements. We have reductions in our code for all kinds of things, including proximity to other transit, affordable housing, et cetera, depending on where you are. So, I think it's one of the things that we hear probably is one of our top frequent complaints about development. But we also have a pretty we have a pretty strong on-street parking enforcement program, and we also have other options to deal when there's a lot of spillover. We recently were revamping our residential permit parking program to make that easier to help with those impacts.
Okay. Questions? Uh-oh. You're all going to do infill, huh? Easy? Everybody, up front. Here we go.
I liked all your suggestions at the beginning of different strategies, and I wonder if you could just kind of redefine the zero lot line, is that what you called it, setback, and then also the cottage lot, how does that differ from like the regular ADU?
Yeah, so the zero side yard provision is just essentially, aside from the periphery lots in planned development or in the residential infill, if there are several lots that are adjacent to each other in the development, you can kind of play with the side yards. So if the lot is a little bit misshapen or something like that, that can be really helpful. You can kind of scoot it right up against the lot line. And then for the second question was on the cottage lot. For the cottage lot, those specifically, the way that it's outlined here is just that that lot already has some sort of access to a public street. So in that example that you saw too, the minimum lot size for the cottage lot was 1,500 square feet as well. For the ADUs, and especially the separate ADUs, I think that Farmington has a lot of different options for the way, and I can't speak too much to Farmington because I don't totally know how it works out there, but there's different options for how small that additional lot is, I believe, or how large it is. So you can kind of play with that a little bit. And then, of course, in a lot of ADUs, unless it's a corner lot or something, then you're going to have issues with access. So dealing with that usually through an easement or something like that to actually access the separate lot.
So this is a question, I guess, for either of you regarding just the process. So state code allows, I believe it's subdivisions with less than 10 lots to be approved administratively, as long as there's not like public right-of-way dedications and things. Maybe more for Nick. Are these smaller infill type projects required to go to planning commission and or council, or is that something that the planning staff can review and approve?
So it depends. Some of them, so we have a process in our code that allows for the planning commission to approve modifications to certain zoning regulations. So basically, well, it's anything except density. So some of those needed reduced setbacks, or especially between structures, so the interior side yards and things like that. But we also have adopted some various incentive programs in the city that give staff that authority too without a public hearing. So if somebody's, if you were here yesterday, you heard a little bit about our affordable housing incentives. So if someone's providing affordable housing incentives, or through our adaptive reuse incentives, so if someone's preserving a historic building, we have a lot of, our code gives us some guardrails, but it allows us to make some modifications at a staff level and approve those things. We deal with, in busy years, we have to do that because we don't have the staff or the planning commission time to actually get all of the things to the planning commission that otherwise would have to go for those modifications. So that's why we have the staff level ability.
Other questions, other thoughts? Uh-oh, way in the back. There's actually people listening in the back? What? Man, Sean, I'm going to catch up with you. There we go.
Real quick, can you hear me? Can you speak a little bit more about road widths, street widths within these infill developments, and whether they're public, private, or a modified public? How are you dealing with that aspect of flexibility?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So we have minimum standards, obviously, for public streets. For private streets, we rely heavily on whatever their fire access is going to be and what the fire department's going to approve. So our fire department's actually pretty flexible with things like what counts as an obstruction, provided they have the width to get in there. That one image I showed of it had the hammerhead turnaround in there. That actually has a very narrow choke point, so you can't even drive a fire truck back there. But the fire department approved an alternative means and methods to put a standpipe out at the street with piping that goes under the driveway that charges those homes and provides them with ways to fight fires back there. And so they were comfortable with that. So I think we're fortunate that we have a fairly flexible fire department that wants to help solutions, and they also understand that, you know, we're infill. There's some things that they won't budge on, you know, like the proximity to, you know, the fire access road has to be within 150 feet of the perimeter of the building, things like that. But our plan development process lets us provide some flexibility with those street widths.
Maybe I'll just add to that for a sec, because I've been running into that in Heber, where they're talking about infill within the older neighborhoods near Main Street. Just want to emphasize the 150 feet, okay, and that is to the back of the house, okay? It's not the front. So that's a pretty big deal, because for fire code folks, if you have a more strict one, they're going to tell you if you don't have that, if you're going beyond that, we got to have 20 feet of pavement, and we got to have, I think it's a 2-foot shoulder, and more houses, wider, all that kind of thing. But I think this is one of the things you got to do. You know, you got to talk with your engineering department, your fire department, and discuss what their standards are before you throw that ordinance together. It was just my 2 bits.
John Lamar, Mill Creek Planning Commission. I was curious about you had mentioned you eliminated the lot coverage, but then there is also maximum building for that lot. So it feels like it's essentially doing the same thing. Why go one way versus leaving it with a maximum lot coverage?
Yeah, so in the zones where we've had infill development work, we don't have a max lot coverage. So we rely strictly on setbacks. It's in our R1 zones where we have the setbacks and the total max lot coverage, which includes not only the house, but any other accessory building, garages, sheds, whatever. So those, what we've done is we've identified those as a barrier because we're to other city goals, mainly reducing our outdoor water use because it's promoting yard space that oftentimes goes unused.
Okay, another question from way back here. Okay.
With the popularity of tiny homes that seems to be popular right now, is that synonymous with your cottage structure? Is that the same thing, or is that something different?
I think that they could fit together very nicely. I think the previous session on modular homes also, I think there's a good amount of crossover, both with a lot of those options, I would say. I think that there's still requirements in terms of the, additional requirements that you'd have to jump through hoops to make it work if you do want to put a tiny home there. But I think that the division would allow for that nicely and separate ownership.
Yeah, and maybe add to that too. I think you got to decide in your ordinance if you're going to put them on foundations or not. Okay, and I think that's, a local decision. If you're going to allow that to be a movable thing. In Farmington, Dave's thing the other day, and I guess it was just before this, I would say they're trying to get ownership there, so movable structures might not happen, but other places that might be okay. Anyway, thoughts?
Yeah, can you speak to your experience with the impact on utilities, infrastructure? That's always a concern that comes up is, can the infrastructure handle more density?
Yeah, I can. One of the things I think to keep in mind is that most cities in Salt Lake, I should probably just focus on Salt Lake, but in our existing neighborhoods, our infrastructure was built for housing that at a time, the number of people per dwelling were way higher than they are now. And so even with this infill housing, when we've gone from having, in 1950 to more than 4 people per dwelling down to right now we're just above 2, our infrastructure sizing was built for that. And so we have space to do it. That doesn't mean we don't have challenges, because all of our big, huge mixed-use areas, they all flow to the same spot eventually, and that's where we've run into capacity issues. But we have our public utilities department in Salt Lake City does a really good job of planning for the future and linking utility needs to our land use plans, and so they know where those are. And as new development comes in, we can work with those developers to build it out. But in our neighborhoods, we're not seeing an issue with that.
Hey, we're gonna have the last question.
Super quick. Can you identify an area in more affluent neighborhoods of Salt Lake City that have infill, or have you seen any gentrification where you've added newer infill in what was maybe a lower neighborhood?
Yeah, so most of our wealthier areas in the city, so the areas that are wealthy now, historically were areas where you could build a mix of housing types. And so even in, I think a lot of people have heard of the Yellcrest neighborhood in Salt Lake City. There's duplexes, there's small apartment buildings in there. I mean, they're not big, they're usually 1 or 2 stories. A ton of basement apartments that have, before those things were prohibited. And so, yeah, we do have that. Most of our big lots, our 10,000 and 12,000 and above lots, are in our most expensive neighborhoods that were built after 1960. And so that's where we're going to get most of the controversy. What's great about our code is that if you're a non-complying lot, so you don't meet the minimum lot area, and you're in a R1 12,000 zone, in our code, you get to use the standards in R1 5,000 already. So even if you have if you won't have space to create a 5,000 square foot lot, you can actually do it without any sort of zoning change or anything like that. You can just go through a subdivision process. As far as any sort of displacement, we haven't seen that from infill development in our neighborhoods where it's occurred. Where we're seeing the displacement is really in areas where, and especially with ownership, but is areas that have very high rental homes and a high number of them. And they're usually not necessarily single family. It's where we have maybe an old fourplex that's in a zone that allows much more density that's being replaced by 8 townhomes for sale. That's where we're seeing the displacement. I mean, it definitely has impacted our areas where we have a higher concentration of our more affordable housing.
Okay, well, I think that's it for us. Let's give Nick and Delaney a hand.